Most football fans, with the yellow shirt and all the iconic images that go with it, it's almost like in the World Cup, if it's not going to be England, you want it to be Brazil.
There's no learning at all. It's like the memory of a goldfish.
We had Marcelo coming up here. We had Maicon in his taxi going up here somewhere.
It's still impossible to get your head round. It's just, you can't believe that Brazil keep making these mistakes.
It's the 8th of July 2014, the first of the World Cup semi-finals in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. The entire footballing world is ready to watch two of the game's international heavyweights go head-to-head, Brazil versus Germany. Yet what unfolded next was unprecedented. A result so shocking and historic that it broke a number of tournament records in the process. The world watched as Brazil, in their own backyard no less, totally crumbled under the expectation of a nation and German pressure. You all know the score. They would go on to lose 7-1. Though this was not just a defeat, but a story of national humiliation and shame, forever etched into the consciousness of the Brazilian public. I'm Shebahn Aherne and welcome to Greatest Games Replayed, the show where we look back at some of football's most memorable fixtures and outline what went right and wrong for each of the teams involved. Each episode we'll be bringing you analysis and breakdowns and ask, could the result have been different with some tactical changes? Today, it's what the Brazilians call the mineral blow, the crushing 7-1 defeat by Germany that saw them miss out on a home World Cup final. But it represents so much more than that. So joining me today to go through it all and ask whether it had to be this way is European football expert Andy Brassell and the Sun's tactics expert Dean Scoggins. Gentlemen, good to be with you today. You're good to go. We've got our lineups all set, but where does this just rank among the surprises in World Cup football? Andy, we'll start with you.
Well, you look at the board and you think, they're wearing the famous yellow. They've got to be better than this, yeah. Surely. It's remarkable, but we can talk about the feeling of a certain shirt that supersedes form, talent of a particular time. But the Brazilian shirt is heavier than most, I think. And you really felt that, not just during this game, actually, but during this whole tournament. I was over there in Brazil for a lot of it. And the level of pressure, carrying the historical hopes in a first home World Cup in over 60 years. And remember the way the last home World Cup ended in 1950, when they lost in the Maracanã to Uruguay. A trauma that stuck with maybe not just one generation, but a couple of generations. And you think, can they get past that? And in fact, they managed to have an idea that's even lower than that.
I mean, Dean, it was a footballing tragedy.
It was, and we've got to remember in this country as well that there's obviously the German feeling that goes with this as well. But most football fans, and with the yellow shirt and all the iconic images that go with it, it's almost like in the World Cup, if it's not going to be England, you want it to be Brazil. You know that feeling of them being like your second team, and Brazil felt that in their own country as well, and obviously what happened afterwards. But yeah, nobody saw it coming. And it was one of those where I was sat in the newspaper office and, looking at lots of empty pages waiting for the football to start and looking to write headlines. And then when the game finished, we almost wasted time because we were sat there in kind of disbelief at what had happened. And actually we have to write headlines that nobody really wanted to write. But another completely iconic, well, I was going to say game, but it was really just a spell of the first half that just tore a footballing nation to pieces.
Unbelievable. Andy, you were in Brazil before this game. What was the feeling then? Because they were undefeated actually going into this game. Yeah,
the feeling was that winning is the only option. And that is the thing. I think Dean sort of touches on it when he talks about the image that we have of Brazil, the yellow shirts, the smiles, the tricks and flicks, Joga Bonito, all that sort of stuff. Actually, if you go back in the previous 30, 35 years of Brazilian football, if you know Brazilian football well enough, what you realise is style is important. The most important thing is winning. And it's interesting when we've had all these discussions in the decade of Gareth Southgate about is he getting enough style out of the players? it's not really a discussion that they'd have that often in Brazil. It's, are they winning? That is the bottom line. Let's find a way to win. And I think particularly post 1966 World Cup, where the feeling is Brazil was sort of beaten up a little bit. They thought in the 70s, that's not going to happen to us again. And they're one of the first national teams that get a full team of physical trainers behind them. They want to be not just the best in terms of technically, they want to be the toughest, they want to be the hardest, because they want to find a way to win, and that is the only thing that counts. And I felt that the whole way during this tournament. And like I said, that leads to the sensation that, especially with a home tournament in one of the most populous football nations with a population of over 200 million, you cannot escape the pressure, no matter where you are. And the thing that always stuck with me, I watched just before I came home actually from Brazil, I watched the last 16 game with Chile, where it went to penalties, on a beach just outside the centre of Rio.
Sounds terrible.
I know.
Are you okay?
It's idyllic now. I've recovered now. But it feels idyllic, and it feels like it should be the most relaxed, happy place ever. It was an MMA fighter's bar, and we were just on the front, and the tension was like unbelievable. As the sun was coming down, it was beautiful and all the rest of it. You couldn't enjoy any of it. And I just remember so much talk about this game is about Thiago Silva. And I think when we get into Thiago Silva, we have to separate Silva, the defender, who's one of the very best of his generation, and Silva, the captain, who's not. Now, of course, he's not here, but I remember him as being kind of the key figure in that penalty shootout against Chile. And of course, they almost didn't make it. They came really close to going out in that game. While the penalty shootout is happening, he's not looking at it. He is sat on the centre spot, facing the other way, crying. And that just shows how much it is. A player that's one big staff, of course, him and Zlatan brought Milan into the post-Ancelotti era. And yet he can't deal with it at all. And that just shows how much is weighing on Brazil all the time.
I mean, you couldn't get away from the disappointment from the fans the time the second goal went in. The players were crying, kids were crying, parents were crying. There were lots of tears. Let's talk about the absence then going into that game. We touched on Thiago Silva, but Neymar not part of it either. Yeah,
and obviously a very young Neymar at this stage, but still, an incredibly talented player. And the Messi factor, not of the same level as Messi, but in Brazil they would all like to compare Neymar to Messi and give you every reason as to why Neymar is on a par with Messi, and to not have him in this game, and then all of a sudden a front three that has a Fred and a Hulk in it instead of Neymar is it's a body blow to the whole country, as well as Andy says, Thiago Silva as well. So they did go into it with these doubts, nagging doubts whether they had the ability to beat the German machine without somebody who was going to provide that X factor that Neymar does and did. It was a huge blow for them. The way that they approached that first half looked like a team who hadn't even come up with an answer, let alone, carry it out.
Yeah. But Neymar, not just as a player, but a leader, is so important in this tournament, because it always feels fated to the Brazilian public and to Brazilian football culture that this is his tournament, the home tournament where he'll lead them to glory. As you say, he's quite young, but the amazing thing about him is he can deal with that pressure, and it's an unbearable amount of pressure that has been on him ever since he's a teenager, and has actually continued after this tournament. And I think it'll be interesting to see how people judge his career 10, 15 years down the line, because I think he's really quite underappreciated for, people wonder what he could have done rather than what he actually has done, which is an enormous amount in the game, really. But he's not only their technical leader, the guy who can open it up in the big moments, and actually he continues to do this for Brazil afterwards, as well as in club football. Not only is he able to lead them, all the other players know that, because there's this bit in the pre-match anthems where the camera's going down the rows of the players doing their anthems, and they're holding Neymar's shirt. And it's like, well, you know, he's not retired. You know, he's had an injury and it's unfortunate that he's not there, but you need to be putting that out of your mind. You know, this is not a testimonial or tribute match to him. This is a World Cup semi-final that needs to be won. And
missing two big players, like you say, the team know it, the fans know that Silva and Neymar aren't there, and Germany just exploited the hell out of them.
They really did, but it wasn't just the lack of those players that, you know, on the field in the game sense that that meant that. Brazil just inexplicably kept emptying the midfield area. And, you know, and we know that there's this, you know, attacking football philosophy and, you know, and as Andy talks about the flicks and the tricks and you know, the everything that goes with wearing that Brazil shirt. But these great Brazil sides down the years, and you go back to 98 and 2002 and the Dunga generation of Brazil, they still did the fundamentals correct. You know, they still had a tactical base to play from. And in this game, it just went completely out the window, and Germany couldn't quite believe their luck. I don't think that even as good a plans as they had, they didn't expect them to come off every time they went forward.
Do you think Germany expected to win this game going into it?
I think they expected to win it. They didn't expect to win it by this distance, is fair to say. And you can sense a little bit of disbelief on their players' faces as it's happening as well, that every time they're attacking, they're scoring. Now, of course, they do have Miroslav Klose, who in this game becomes the World Cup Finals top scorer of all time. But it's not just about him. There are so many other options. And the supporting cast, well, they're not really a supporting cast. They're sort of co-headliners. This is a Germany team that is sort of the apex of something that's happened since the turn of the century. If we go back to Euro 2000, where they lose in the groups to England, this is a real low point for German football. Not just because they're losing to England, who they always beat in major tournaments up until that point, but because it's a Germany team with, they feel, the public feel, very little skill and very little flair. Not just a Germany team that's not one of their best, but a Germany team that just doesn't excite anyone. And at that point, they decide, OK, we're just not producing the players. So there's more of an emphasis put on the clubs to invest in their youth academies, to train players in a more modern way. And you're getting a technically adept German side here. A German side, a lot of whom would probably get into that Brazil side. And how many times have you been able to say that in football history? Because you think of them as having quite different, diverse philosophies. But German football in the 21st century is coming more into the modern age. There are more flair players than there've been available to Germany for more than a generation, and that's why they're able to exploit the spaces.
Well, let's get into the game and let's find out exactly how Brazil managed to concede 5 goals in 18 minutes. So it all starts with a corner and Thomas Müller.
Yeah, and I think that first goal, which wasn't really anything tactical, I think it was just Brazil completely switching off and probably all that occasion stuff that we talked about getting to them. There are actually 3, perhaps even 4 Brazil players not marking anybody, and there were only actually 4 Germans in the penalty area. And the fact that Müller can just peel off the back of it and find some space, it was just a defence completely switching off. But the knock-on effect with that was massive.
It's one of the biggest domino effects you can imagine in football, really. Something that Germany can't believe they're able to keep plundering, and Brazil just completely lose their heads. But I think the fact that Müller does find the space is really important, because we see him here like nominally in a sort of like right wing, right-sided attacker position. But do we associate Thomas Müller with that? Not always. We kind of associate him as being a second striker. Could you really describe him as that? Not really. Could you describe him as a number 10? Probably not. And the amazing thing about Thomas Müller, particularly in a modern football context, and particularly in the context of this, where Brazil want a physical team, is the fact you look at Müller, he's someone who's been a giant of European football for a decade and a half, maybe more. And why is it? Well, it's not because he's super strong. It's not because he's super fast. It's not because he's better technically than anyone else. But what they call him in Germany is the Raumdeuter, so the sort of exploiter of space. And that's exactly what he does in this. He finds the spot where the spaces are. So he finds it at that corner. And as the game goes on, it's about him versus this guy, Marcelo. Now, of course, he is a fullback, that's a very modern fullback. He sort of evolves in the post-Cafu world. Cafu completely changes what a fullback is about. But Marcelo is someone who's so good on the ball, sometimes he gets a little bit carried away and he leaves a lot of space behind him. And that for Thomas Muller, like Muller starts there, he could end up there, he could end up there, next to Klose, but he sticks really to the right side because that's where the space is and he's able to keep exploiting that. Now that's not all Marcelo's fault as well. You look at Luis Gustavo, who's played some of his career as a defensive midfielder, some at centre-back, occasionally at left-back. He's meant to drop in there and help him. But because Germany have got all these players who can make it happen in the middle, he doesn't really know what to do. Do you go over there and cover Marcelo and block off Thomas Muller? Or do you block off these guys in the middle?
Okay.
I think it's important to note that the Brazil had no structure. And Germany really did. So just to go sort of modern game nerdy just for a second, okay?
Go on then.
So what?
Get yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. What teams do now, okay, is when they invert a fullback, is the reason for doing this is to create a strong box in midfield, okay? So we literally mean a box by that. So let's take, if Brazil did it correctly with Marcelo in this game, the fullback would invert, okay? So they move into a box shape in midfield with 3 of the midfield players and 1 of the fullbacks. And then they come into a shape, something like that, which enables teams to attack with a 3-2-5 shape. And that's very common now, especially with a Chelsea under Maresca, a Man City under Guardiola. That's a very common form to be into, right? But what Brazil did after going 1-0 down and losing their heads completely was we had Marcelo coming up here. We had Maicon in his taxi going up here somewhere. And then we had this box create. Oscar was going up to join the front man. And so we had this box of sort of 4 players. And as I said before, they'd completely emptied this midfield area, which then means, as Andy said, Muller can exploit all of this space here. Ozil can exploit all of this space here because this really strong axis of German midfield of Schweinsteiger and Kroos and who's the third one I'm missing, Andy? Khedira are in this position where what they're going to do is they're going to overload in whatever position they go into. So if Marcelo does come into this position here, we're overloading here. With a triangle of 3 players to beat him. If he goes missing and the ball comes over to this side of the field and Maicon's marking here, we're going to overload in this position and we've got someone to underlap or overlap that side. So Germany, with a 3-man midfield, not a 4-man midfield, are managing to dominate a midfield area. And they couldn't quite believe what was going on. There's a moment where Oscar comes back into this area here and goes walking past the ball and Germany have got 5 attackers.
Yeah.
Again, and against the Brazil midfield and defence, which is sort of, let's pick up closer because he's the danger man. And then there's these other 4 players just wandering into space. And it was, to be quite blunt, a complete and utter shambles of a tactical approach.
But it happens time and time again as well, Andy. Like,
yeah, it does.
Front 5 time and time again for 18 minutes, those goals. I mean,
no, there's no learning at all. It's like the memory of a goldfish, isn't it? But I guess because it all happens so quickly, Shebahn, there's no time to recompose themselves. When we talk about momentum in football, this is the biggest example of that you will see. And for Germany, there's very little risk in doing this, because they've got players who are so good on the ball. And the other thing is, I think when you look at a World Cup or European Championship winning side, we talk about momentum. You also need to sometimes lean into happy accidents that kind of evolve as the championship goes on. Now, Germany got a big problem at left back during this tournament. They end up with this guy, Benedikt Höwedes, very, very good centre-back, not a left back, not even left-footed. But so you think, what is the major problem for a right-footed left-back? It's that they always have to keep coming inside. For him, it's that he's not really an attacker as well. So that's part of it as well. But why does that help in this game? Well, because you've got so much space down there. Now, Philipp Lahm, who plays left-back at the 2006 World Cup, but is also right-footed. He's someone who ends up playing as a midfield player later in his career. He's still a right-back, and he's Germany's best right-back. They decide he's the best right-back option for them in this tournament. This is pre-Joshua Kimmich, of course. Now, how does that help? Well, I think because this almost switches into a 3, and Hervedis is happy with that, really, because he is a centre-back. So you have Boateng, who's a great right-sided, played right-back as well, great right-sided centre-back. You've got Hummels in the middle, who's the passer who can really bring it out. And you've got Hervedis on the other side, great back 3. And Philipp Lahm, who's a right-back, who can play left-back, he can play midfield, he's over there. Mm-hmm. So you're never really exposed in the midfield when he steps up either.
And that's absolutely bang on. And in this area, when Brazil did win the ball back, Germany had that overload in midfield again, and that it was like, I mean, it was probably like they had 2 extra players, but it actually felt like they had an extra man. And it's something that it will and is a game that coaches and tacticians look at a lot, because yes, Brazil were shambolic, but the intelligence of Schweinsteiger as well. Because, I mean, Schweinsteiger, we often, when he came to Man United, he didn't quite know what player he was. Some games he was seen as an attacking, goal-scoring midfielder. And actually, in this game, he plays as the deeper man, where you would expect that to be Khedira, really. And Kroos and Khedira just completely manipulated everything that was going on in front of them. And it gave this sort of balance to the game where Ozil was able to come deep and collect the ball. Closer had, all the movement in this area. And as Andy said, Lahm moving into that area meant every time Brazil did get the ball in these areas, they hit this wall of German midfield. And, and Hummels is sat there just picking off loose balls and playing it back into people's feet afterwards. And it was a wild 20 minutes. I
mean, whilst they're taking their pick as to who's going to score next, there were some random mistakes from players you don't expect it, like Fernandinho. What was he doing? Yeah,
and I think there's a bit of old man in a storm, really. Where's the help around him? It's very difficult. And someone like him, you're right to point him out, I think, Shebahn, because he is a player who, you look at his role at Shakhtar, you look at his role at Manchester City, he's not just someone who's really reliable in the centre of midfield and someone who you feel anchors it, and of course he plays deeper as his career goes on, and particularly at Manchester City. He's someone he's kind of like the dad of the group, but does he get the chance to be that in this Brazilian dressing room? I think is the question. He's still quite a new starter for Brazil at this point, so maybe he's not quite got the chops to say, OK, this is what we're doing. I'm going to lead us out of this. And are the other players listening? Are the other players able to respond? Because you talked about the reaction of people in the crowd. It starts to turn really quickly, and it's clear that it's just this sense of panic that this nightmare is happening, and no one is able to get a grip of that. Now, I do think, we spoke about Thiago Silva at the top. I'm not convinced. Like, Neymar is a big miss, clearly. Thiago Silva, I think there's everything to suggest that he would have been submerged by this emotional tidal wave as well. What he wouldn't have done, though, is kept bringing the ball out like David Luiz did.
That's exactly the point I was just about to make.
David Luiz becomes the de facto leader of the defence. And then when he comes out and there's no one behind him, you've got a massive problem.
Yeah. And, and that, just to get into that position again where Lahm sort of joined the midfield and Germany formed that box in midfield that I was talking about before, and Klose is in this position here. Let's just say Brazil have got the ball at the back and Germany are in a fairly similar shape to this. If you've got a defender in David Luiz who has this tendency to either hit a 50-yard ball into, space or into the crowd if he gets it wrong, but then to wander out into these areas with the ball, that means that Fernandinho in this position is very unsure. Very, very unsure of whether he's being the protector because he's got defenders either side of Klose, or he's the cover man because he's got to then help out back in here because David Luiz has gone for a wander. And when then that happens, you see him get robbed in midfield because he hasn't got, it's an overused phrase now, but he hasn't got that bounce pass to go back into David Luiz and give him a get out to go the other way. He's now in a position where I'm either playing quite a risky ball into this area here, or I'm trying to turn my man and get out of trouble. And that all, again, comes from a disorganised structure where you've got defenders, both fullbacks who want to go in that direction and not really want to stay where they are, and a centre-back who is ill-disciplined at best.
Which takes us to the fifth goal, which, Andy, might be the worst of the lot of them, would you say?
Maybe, but like by that point, the game is already lost. I think when they're 4-0 down, I think that the fifth follows the fourth so quickly, and that they just, as you say, turn it over in basketball parlance, and that is what it feels like at this point. It feels like a momentum shift in an NBA game where all of a sudden the tide is absolutely unstoppable and the defending team can't compose itself in possession at all. I think partly because they know the game is gone after four, so you know that's coming.
I'm impressed you can remember the order of the goals, because that's the thing about a game like this, is that I'm really struggling to remember which order they happened in, because there was such just a litany of disaster that it's like, which one was that? Was that the third or the fifth? And the
players' reactions as well. The German players, they're kind of in disbelief that they're getting the opportunity to score against
and Kroos's face is something.
That's the third, right? I think that's the third. And then closer, and then closer with the follow-up goal, after Cesar's save, where he's the other side of the defenders, and he just sort of, well, I'll tap it in then if you guys aren't going to clear it. And and that, to Andy's point, is they've gone. At that point, they have gone. Heads, hearts, everything has gone by that stage.
It's an incredibly naive performance from Brazil. What could they have done differently? I mean, surely there were changes that could have been made that could have stopped the run.
I think there was the corner at the first goal is the unfortunate thing where then the crowd turns and everyone's thinking, oh no. And that obviously is a mentality thing. But at that stage, that's where, as Andy talks about the experienced players in there, your Maicon and your Marcelo have got to go. It's the old adage of 5 minutes, lads. Just put your foot on the ball and just find our shape again. They're an international football team in a World Cup semi-final, okay? They should know what shape they're trying to play. And it was very difficult to identify when you look at the first half performance. But in that 5 minutes, they've got to say, right, let's just sit here for a moment. The Germans would have been happy with that. The Germans would have been thinking that Germany weren't thinking at 1-0, they're there for the taking here. They're thinking that at 2-0 and 3-0 and 4-0, let's finish the game. But at 1-0, they're thinking, right, we're 1-0 up. And they would have been going, right, 5 minutes, assess. And then all of a sudden, they're picking the ball up in these areas again, 4-on-3. And it was like, well, they're just giving the ball to us in these really dangerous areas around the area where you're 2 passes away from a shot on target. And that's when Germany went forward. But still, in those moments, you'll see screenshots. And if you go back and watch the highlights, you'll see that you've got the fullbacks up here. And straight away, these enormous areas of space, which these are the real danger zones, right? Your centre-backs are looking after these areas, but these are the real danger areas for teams where you're in behind a full-back and you're playing cutbacks across goal. And Germany, a couple of times, actually played one extra pass than they probably needed to, but they just tapped it in an empty net because they were in there and it was 3-4 v 2 or 3 most of the time.
And Germany are a terrible matchup for Brazil at this point, because we talked about the changing face of the sort of players that Germany produces. There are a lot of these 10s, 9.5 type players that they have. So the players who can drift into those spaces, okay, Miroslav Klose, if he occupies the centre-backs, you're in straight away, because he's one of the best strikers really of all time at doing that. You think of how physically capable he is, how capable he is on the air, although he becomes better and better on the ground as time goes by. But really, it's about these guys who can drift into that space. So be it Müller, be it Özil, be it Kroos, who's a slightly more forward type of player than the one he ended up being in the latter part of his career. I mean, he was a number 10 when he was at Leverkusen, for example. And so they have exactly the right sort of players to exploit this.
Yeah, and then Germany aren't even playing with wingers.
No.
At this point. And
no, they were sort of the inverted players. But I mean, Oscar is the the sort of one I remember from the game in thinking that he was like he was sort of standing with his feet in concrete because the world had disappeared around him, and and then you really were playing with 10, because he wasn't involved at all. I know he got the goal later on, but he just wasn't involved, and then all of a sudden, as Andy says, you've got the high football intelligence of your Muller and Ozil, and then you add to that a player like Schweinsteiger who's just going to pick off passes and send you back the other way. And we just ended up in this situation where it was this sort of semicircle of German players swarming on that 4 Brazilians with those fullbacks and wingers, or not really wingers, but out of the game. And the amount of time that the ball entered the penalty area in those 15 minutes would have given defensive coaches nightmares for years.
And part of it's the outball as well, though, isn't it? Because if we were talking about Miroslav Klose and not just the goals, but the physical strength to occupy defenders, Fred does not have any of that. Mm-hmm. There is someone who's a very, very good finisher, who had a very good career for what Brazil need in this particular situation. When Germany start getting on top of them, there is no outball because he's just not good enough. He's a striker, he's a big guy, but he likes the ball in front of him. So that creates a problem because as soon as the ball comes up the pitch, it's going straight back at them.
Yeah.
And you've got the physicality of Hummels and Hoedes there, as you mentioned.
Boateng is probably the best defender in this tournament as well.
Like I say, this is Brazil, though, and I know we're absent with Thiago and his leadership and Neymar's brilliance, but from that first goal, Dean, how should they have reset?
They should have just kept the ball for a few minutes, and accepted that, look, they are fabulous footballers. They're playing for the Brazilian national team in a World Cup. They're fabulous footballers. So for a moment, they've got to get themselves back into that shape that they should have been in and where they're creating overloads, OK? So they're creating positions where they've got a triangle of players around a winger. Both sides, they've got a box in midfield that means that Klose's working very hard. And just for a few minutes, not necessarily on the edge of your own box, but hopefully up on the halfway line, you're keeping the ball and then you settle everybody down and you settle the crowd down. And there would have been players in Brazil's front 5 who, by the time that they were 5-0 down, had had less than 10 touches.
So they should have done it. But Andy, like you say, with the pressure on these Brazilians, home tournament, people in tears, could they have actually done that?
No, and when Dean was lining it up then, I thought he'd have made a much better coach of Brazil than Luis Felipe Scolari in this tournament. And the problem with the chief strength of Scolari as an international coach, and I say international coach rather than club coach, is also his biggest weakness. Because you look at his other successes, you look at 2002, where they do really badly in the qualifying group. They aren't really one of the favourites coming in, and the resurrection of Ronaldo does it all. Mm-hmm. You look at when he got Portugal to the final of 2004, after they had a really bad start in Euro 2004, and they probably should have got past Greece in the final, certainly with the players they had available to him. What is it that Scolari does every time? It's not actually about tactics. What he does is he does the gaucho, the southern Brazilian cowboy thing of banging his fist on the table and going, come on, lads, let's fight for the country. It's kind of what we want English coaches to do. It's all about how demonstrative you are on the touchline. And even when he was coaching a country that wasn't his own, in Portugal in Euro 2004, he went, well, what I need you to do as Portuguese, be proud, get your flags out, put them on your balcony, wave them from your flagpoles. Come on, we're all getting behind the lads. And it really created a feeling. Now, what's the other side of this, particularly in a home World Cup? Firstly, it creates an intensity of feeling that is beyond anything you can imagine. And really, this intensity of feeling could have been used to their failure, because you think of these players, you think of people who love football, like Thomas Muller, like Ozil, like Miroslav Klose. For them to be able to play a World Cup in Brazil, you spoke to a lot of the players around at the time, the first thing they would go is, playing a World Cup in Brazil, it's everything I dreamed of as a child. But instead of using that for something to put their foot on the chest of the visitors, they actually let it inspire the visitors and overwhelm them. And I think because of the sort of character Scolari is, because he leans into the emotion, firstly, he's unable to make them put a stop to that and say, look, let's take a deep breath and just break it down simply. And secondly, he's not tactically good enough.
Well, it would seem that way. And like you say, he's so pumped and the emotions have changed. How would you rate Scolari out of 10 based on that?
On that game, I think the scale can't quite go so low. But the Neymar and Thiago Silva factor is high, but and we'll never know what happened on the training ground in the 48 hours before that game. I'd like to think that he'd said to them, this is the structure and this is the way we're going to play. But, you know, as Andy's insight there into everything that was going on at the time, perhaps he didn't. Yeah. Perhaps it was, come on, lads, let's go, you know, and passion can only get you so far in modern football, you know, and all that, you know, tub thumping we've seen from England managers that have just not worked on the football field in years gone by. They weren't set up right. They didn't have a plan as to what happens. Teams have to have plans as to what will happen if things go wrong. As well. You have to have a plan to say you're not the only team on the field. Other teams might do something to disrupt you. And as I say, that I thought the German midfield three was actually set up slightly different as to we thought. And because of the change at the back and because Lahm is so flexible and moved into midfield, they were getting overrun. So they should have had that conversation pre-match. Right, what happens if Germany do play three at the back and then they play five in midfield? Yeah. Surely they should have had that conversation and then they could have made a bit of a switch up in the game for that to happen. And, you know, sometimes we hear players say, oh, you know, or commentators say, oh, they just need to get to half-time here. They really need half-time. Crikey, they needed half-time after 12 minutes. So by the time they got to half-time, it was so written in history that it was done.
Let's end this by talking about the impact this game had, really, because we know Germany went on to win it. But had Brazil had won this game, would they have won the World Cup that year?
No, I don't think so, because they still wouldn't have had Neymar for the final. And like I said, when you look at the emotions that come into playing for the Brazilian national team, and I know I keep saying it.
No, but it's important, and I think it's
massively important.
Look at the pictures, look at the fans. I mean, there's nothing like that.
But I think this is the absolute apex or nadir of that, really. The home World Cup is too much for them. And it's too much for them at other points, but they just about get through it. It's too much for them against Chile, and Chile should have beaten them in the last 16, but they just about get through it. And they get through it actually in the quarterfinal with Colombia with some pretty rough tactics as well, even though it's Neymar that ends up injured in that. I mean, Colombians still complain about how James was kicked in that game, who's probably the best player of the tournament. But when I think about how difficult that is to cope with, it's not just about this World Cup. It's about the honour, the prestige, the pressure of representing Brazil. I spoke to Michel Bastos just after the 2010 World Cup, where it all went horribly wrong for them in the quarter-final against the Netherlands. They're winning, they're on top of them, and they have a really bad spell where the Netherlands go 2-1 up, Brazil go down to 10 men. And the way that Michel Bastos put it to me, he said, I went back to the dressing room afterwards and we sat there as a group, so like the 23 players, all the support staff, everyone who helps us and the coaches and all the rest of it. So there's about 45 guys in the room. He said, if you can imagine, and I know we're all more in touch with our feelings now than we were in 2010, but 45 blokes in a room all crying their eyes out, and it was like that for 20 minutes. And that is actually like quite an intense thing to feel. And then you add to that the home World Cup, that's something else. So even if you forget the fact that Neymar is not just a brilliant player, but a player who is able to cope with all that, to lead the team. And that's why they do that sort of tribute to him before, because he's not just a technical leader, he's an emotional one. He's the one guy who was felt since he was a young teenager, I was born for this. I was born to be as good as Pelé. And you know what? When I get my opportunity, I'm absolutely going to seize it. And it was only injury that stopped him doing that. Yeah. He is the only way that not only do they find a way to break down Argentina in the World Cup final, but they find a way to cope with the occasion. If they couldn't cope with this semi-final on an emotional level, how would they have done it with a final?
Yeah. And this really, really awful common trait now of modern football of us wearing T-shirts before games for injured players is, you flip that around on its head to what happened there with Brazil, is that they weren't holding up a shirt which was actually symbolic of we'll win this for Neymar, which is what they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
They were holding up a symbol of we can't win this without Neymar.
Yeah.
And that's what it became. And, just back onto the where the game was there, is that Neymar carried the hopes of the nation, right? He also carried the hopes in the match with the football, because if we talked about how you counter that and what you do after you score, you're looking to players like that. You're looking to your superstar player at that moment. It's not necessarily just to score a goal. You're looking for them to change the balance and alter the momentum of the game. And if Neymar picks the ball up in this area, his favourite area of the field when you're in a defensive position, to pick the ball up, naturally, German players are going to think, oh dear, it's Neymar. Mm-hmm. And so then your Lahm goes back into position, Schweinsteiger and Khedira come into a position, and then you're going to get Müller as a brilliant workhorse come back into a position like that. And look, all of a sudden, Germany have got 4 players thinking about one, which means then your attacking players in other areas have got more space. Mm-hmm. And so that's what they didn't have. And the aura around Neymar wasn't there. And before those mistakes were even made and everything went that way, that natural thing of Germany would have been thinking, even if we give the ball away, it's okay because it's not going to Neymar.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he would have given Brazil a fighting chance in this semi-final, which they didn't have. I still think Germany would have been too good for them.
I agree.
And I think actually we talked about before about Jerome Boateng being the best defender in this tournament. I think he sets the tone in the first game they play against Portugal in Salvador, because Cristiano Ronaldo, who doesn't come into this tournament as his fittest self, but is still a left-sided forward at that point. Like we said, Boateng's really a centre-back, but he goes out and plays as a right-back, almost man-marking Ronaldo in this. And it's Germany saying, OK, we've got the flair, but we've also got the smarts to counter whatever you can do. And we're tough enough to get through the difficult bits, and they did have their difficult bits, like Manuel Neuer really had to show up against Algeria, who gave them a great game. But every one of those players, like you need in any World Cup qualifying campaign, had their moment where they instinctively knew that it was their moment to step forward.
Yeah, I mean, like we say, it was national humiliation for Brazil and for Germany. I mean, what they were feeling, how is this game viewed?
Well, it was this incredible statement that came out afterwards as well, with Lowe saying that we spoke in the dressing room about not embarrassing Brazil. And almost taking their foot off the gas at 5-0 up, and it seems like, an amazing thing. But as we said at the beginning,
they weren't that committed to it. They brought on Andre Schürrle.
Yeah. Well, I think Schürrle wanted to make a point that he wasn't selected and wanted to score. But look, I'm not saying they were saying let Brazil back into the game, but there was definitely a feeling at half time that this could be any score.
Yeah.
This could be any score. And would the Brazilians even have the courage to come back out for the second half after, what it was, physically or metaphorically. So, there was, for an international manager in a World Cup semi-final to be sort of saying, right, OK, lads, don't get injured now. Take your foot off the pedal a little bit. We've got a final coming up. I mean, even that is just, off the chart. It's incredible. And, and that sort of German professionalism that comes into it. And, even with that English hat on, you can't help but admire, what a great side they really were.
It was ruthless, completely ruthless. Where does this game rank in games where you've been surprised with a better result? Where would that?
The one?
The one.
I mean, it's just... It's still impossible to get your head round. It's just... you can't believe that Brazil keep making these mistakes, but also you can't believe how relentless Germany are. But when you think of Brazil and Germany, they're the two names of World Cup history. It's not meant to be like this. It's meant to be a fight to the absolute end, and it just wasn't.
There's a brilliant exhibit at the German Football Museum, which is a must go to if you're in Dortmund, and about obviously the World Cup win, but there's the amount of time that the visitors, including myself, that spent at this part of that World Cup journey instead of the final and the Goetze goal is it just shows how much of an unbelievable day it was.
Yeah, like the happiness and the sadness, all rolled into one. The surprise along the way as well. This game, I think you're right. The amount of people always reflect on this as one of football's greatest shocks.
Yeah, definitely.
Any final thoughts? Because I know you two are obsessed.
I think that it's such a shame from a World Cup perspective that we didn't see the best of Brazil, which obviously included Thiago Silva and Neymar. And then there was the final, which included Messi, obviously, which went the Germans' way. So there was a fairy tale final of Neymar v Messi that had been written before the tournament, but yeah, without a concrete way of playing and without a setup that works, without your star players, then you don't win World Cups.
I guess my question is, how did Brazil ever get over this? Because they lost one World Cup on home soil in 1950, but that was quite different. Whereas that was a uniquely Brazilian trauma for that particular generation, or a football trauma for that particular generation. The fact is, football wasn't widespread on television. It's just sort of myth and bits of history and stuff. Whereas you get to 2014, it's the biggest show on earth. You have 36 cameras, maybe more, in the stadium. There's many journalists as you can fit in there, as well as all the supporters, people watching it all over the world in HD. And it happened on their home soil. And the sheer distance of it, the fact that they just couldn't deal with the biggest match in many of these players' lives. I spoke to David Luiz about it a couple of years afterwards, actually. And it's one of those things where it's such a deep humiliation. As a journalist, your instinct is to ask questions, and you're like, I need to get the answer however, really. But, you're trying to be sensitive about it because it's such a deep trauma. Yeah. And actually, it reminded me, the way he responded to it reminded me a little bit of that Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem, The Ancient Mariner, where he's shot the albatross and he can't stop telling the wedding guests about it. So he's condemned to repeat this tragedy that's affected his life again and again and again. And David Luiz was a little bit like that. He said, look, I still think about it every day, every single day. Yeah. And that was after, he continued to have a really great career. He went on to PSG after that. He played for a lot of the greats in European football and won some great trophies. He had some heroic moments, like where he contributed to the 2012 Champions League final, where he's basically on one leg for Chelsea, and they finally got their European Cup. And yet there was this thing that he couldn't shake, and he feels he has to go over it again and again and again. Now, maybe it'll be different for other generations of Brazilian players, but the pressure on those current Brazilian players to put right something that has nothing to do with them, that weight is real.
Yeah. I mean, they still think about it. You guys clearly still think about it. You still think about it if you've been watching this, but that is all we've got time for today. Wonderful stuff. You guys could have done a job on that day for Brazil. Andy Brassell, Dean Scoggins, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to be back replaying more of football's greatest games very soon, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.